This is Volume 1 of Space Opera's core book. As you can see, fairly thin. I mean, for the time period, this is actually a thick book. And if you look at the font size, I think the font size is set at 10. So they crammed a lot of material into the, was it, not 80, 85, 90 pages that makes up this particular book. This was a game system that was created in the late 70s. It was published in 1979 by Jeff D. by a company called Fantasy Games Unlimited, FGU. I don't know how many other game systems they put out. I'm pretty sure they are the ones that put out Chivalry and Sorcery, but don't quote me on that. This doesn't have any other game systems listed in it. Copyright 1980. They spent roughly 3 years creating the game system based off of what their entries say. So I'm going to read you. I've had some conversations with Ronnie and a couple other people recently about Space Opera. And it was, I believe it was Ronnie Bradley who said that he had thumbed through it on the shelf and chose not to buy it at the time because of its overt complexity. It was very obvious it was going to be a complicated game system, perhaps even chunky. And I can't disagree with that, having ran it for a number of years. On the other hand, its system was set up to be simplistic in reality, based off of need. And what I meant by that, and it says it right here in its introduction section, that you should use what you need from it. If your game system doesn't require or you choose not to go into certain elements or directions, then you don't apply those rules. And that simplified things considerably. But the fact was, they included a lot of complex and what seemed like unnecessary rules and formulas because they wanted to cater to a more mechanic-based, detail-oriented group of players who were growing in sophistication compared to the earlier stuff that was available. So they eventually had to, their choice was to overcomplicate things. And I think the argument can be made, if you look at some of the game systems that have followed in the decades since, that there are others that are overly complicated or expanded to the point that they become very convoluted because of the sheer amount of additional supplemental rules that were provided for people to accomplish a lot of things that players come up and say, I would like to do. And I've learned that through trial and error with creating my own game system, that sometimes that's how it works out. When I first started out to create my game system with the working title of Stellar Frontiers, it was actually a much simpler basic system. Game rulebook was only about yay thick, and the concept behind it is my version of Civilization or some cities built in space. You're colonizing, and you're building up your little empire. And then players would come along who were beta testing and said, I want to do this, or how about this, or how do we go about doing this? And I had to expand on the initial rules, and eventually the core book for the rules end up coming up to 300 plus pages. So a lot at font 10 for that matter, because you can only shove so much stuff into a page and still allow room for some kind of rudimentary artwork, which is something else. The artwork in here is pretty crude by today's standards. None of it's in color. A lot of 2D, two-dimensional drawings and schematics for maps and stuff for layouts for like ships. Very crude stuff. Look like the sort of things that we would have created when we were kids. But it worked. That was the main thing. It said, where is it? The original concept was to create a game that would not need the usually innumerable supplements to its rules, but would be a complete science fiction role-playing game. Thus, we wanted a game that would allow players to role-play all of the most popular roles for the characters in an entire genre of science fiction literature. This called for a game to handle the future warrior, mercenary, the free trader, the asteroid miner, the planetary explorer, and the first contact man, and a member of the diplomatic corps or spy service. We needed science and the possibility of scientist characters with medicine playing major roles. As if this was not enough, the decision was made to base the game on the grand tradition of space opera in the vein of E.E. Doc Smith and most recently Star Wars from George Lucas. This meant that we would have to allow for the psionic powers to so prevalent in the Lensman series and the Star Wars with the quote Force. Space opera is not an easy game. The individual systems are actually fairly simple and quite logical, but the sheer number of systems can be staggering. Players should realize that we have allowed for alien player characters from races which could exist on planets habitable by human race, as these are the races that whom humans would have to deal. Naturally, players may have to decide to run their entire campaigns of the universe with only human characters, both player and NPC. Similarly, players may decide to totally disregard the psionic talents section of these rules and concentrate on a more scientific type of universe according to the laws that they are currently understood, but the systems are there for those who choose to use them. It may be that the Star Master decides to allow psionic talents to only NPCs, or may realize according to these rules that such talents are quite rare and will add a truly exciting element to the game. The apparent complexity of some of the rules dealing with such factors as fatigue and wind is deceptive. These systems are included for the hardcore role player who demands such detail and accuracy in rules. For the average campaign, these systems can be ignored with no deterrent to the game as a whole. Thus, these rules are no more complex than the average role-playing game. They're merely more complete and hence more massive. We feel that we achieved the objectives we established several years ago and can allow players to simulate the adventures from virtually any subgenre within the science fiction literature. We included combat rules and detailed starship rules, including starship combat and the tradition of the space opera, and cover virtually every type of skill and occupation that could be desired in an interstellar setting of the game. Adventures can take place on alien planets or asteroids or in space itself, or could involve the interrelationship between powerful interstellar empires. The game is complete as it stands and will not need supplements to add these rules for players actively. It's not to say further material space opera will not be available, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so basically, if you think about it, from the beginning, they decided, okay, we want to create a core book or a rule book that is self-contained, that we don't need to come back and add supplement after supplement after supplement after supplement to cover expanding things or concepts that players may or may not want to do. This is what makes it seem so complicated and complex to play, because the sheer volume of additional stuff that was packed in the original core book. By modern standards, and you all know this if you really take a good look at your books, why, and I'll use Dungeons & Dragons as an example because it's the one that seems to stand out the most for most people. You got your dungeon match, the GM guide. Then they came out with a GM guide too. You got the player handbook and player handbook 1, 2, 3. You see, and then you got additional like magic compendiums and combat and warrior and magic user. And every one of these supplement books adds additional rules and takes the game into different directions that allow for expanded play. So what these people did was try to put as much of that in the initial offering as possible. Now, by today's standards, it's not necessarily a monetarily wise thing for the company to do. They want you to purchase 40 damn books. They want you to have a dozen core books in order to get as much out of the game as you want to get out of it. And there's the key. What are you looking to get out of your game? Whether you're the game master or you're the player, what is it? Level do you wish to take it to? And if you want to take it to a much higher level, having the mechanics and the base rules to allow you to do that is the whole point, right? It's kind of the whole point of this. So I can fully understand what there was going on up here in their mindset when they created the basics for this. Now, they emphasize this over and over again that they have based a lot of their stuff. This is one of the second thing by today's standards that would make space opera so archaic or seemingly out of date, is that it catered to an older audience of players. Many of the middle-aged men of the time in the mid 70s, early 70s, had grown up on the old sci-fi masters, the novelists of the Lensmans and Heinlein and Asimov and so on and so forth. And a lot of their science fiction is not your cookie cutter McDonald's Star Wars type stuff that you have prevalent today. And there was a lot more cerebral sci-fi going on back then. You had a lot more. If you look at the differences, the key differences between, say, Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Wars is the grand hero's journey, the grand story in a massive universe, the huge space opera that's got multiple opportunities and multiple levels and layers and places to go. And in Star Trek, where it's more about the high adventure and interaction between players and the villains. Where in Star Trek is more about the high ideals and morals and standards of human society as it expands and interacts and encounters other civilizations alien to themselves. And it is emphasizes many times from the very beginning, emphasizes things like science and medicine. This is why you have Spock as a science officer who is such a key character. This is why Bones McCoy, as the medical officer, was a key character. And if you go back and look at the individual episodes of all the series, especially the original, you will see that they focused on different aspects of those strengths over time. It wasn't always about the swashbuckling, adventurous style of Captain Kirk's type of series. You had episodes where science saved the day or fixed the problem, and then there were episodes where medicine was the focus. We saved the population, or we saved the individuals, or we saved these people, or somehow we can't save them all because. So they considered that and included those mechanics in here. You don't find a lot of that type of mechanics in other game systems. You don't. Now, if you look at FAST's early release of the Star Trek role-playing game system, it does have a lot of science and medicine-based stats and rules and classes and things in there. But other game systems, not so much. Look at Star Wars. Star Wars just does a wink and a nod on that stuff because it's not prevalent to the theme of the game or the movie or the franchise. It's not about science. Science is considered old and archaic, and it's a given. We don't know why the hyperdrive works. We just know it does, and we don't care. And there are specialists who know and care, and we let them worry about it if we need it, but we never bring it into the story. Medicine and science, we don't worry about the plague or somebody getting ill and sick and having to dementia or space viruses or anything like stuff, because humanity and the alien races have been interacting for tens of thousands of years, and all that stuff's been figured out a long time ago. Every now and then it crops up as a kind of sidebar story, but it's not prevalent in the system. That's one of the key things that sets this game system apart from all those others, which I challenge, if you can acquire the core books, even if you don't get any of the other supplement books, and there's not that many, there's maybe 20 or so, 24, and I don't have a lot of the modules. I didn't go and buy them because, in part, the whole basis and premise of these rule books was to not need those, to give you the base mechanics you need to create those modules of your own. And I was in that age bracket where I wanted to be the creative person who spun the story up. And so I didn't purchase the modules, and they didn't, more than a couple, and they didn't offer any additional material to the game, unlike some modules do, like in Middle-earth. Like I've said over and over in my reviews of the MERP system, that almost all the modules, at least better than 60% of them, add to something. They're a piece of a bigger puzzle. So they focus on an area that expands on the other stuff. Now, there's a handful of modules, about 40% or so, that are just pure adventure modules and have no substance other than giving your people something to do, the players and the GM something easy to do without having to do a lot of back work for it, which is what they're for. Not trying to rail on them or any of that stuff. No. We talk about it, and of course, I'm already into 15 minutes, and I'm afraid this is going to run into a half hour no matter how I do it. You've got your basic stuff, and there's a lot of things I'd like to cover, I just can't do it all in one, and I don't want to make a whole series on this because I don't think that enough people would care about it to do it. But there are some elements here that are questions that crop up a lot in the Brigade channel and other channels, and we have various answers from them. These guys from the old school mindset, you know, have addressed those in the book from the very get-go. As example, Chapter 1.9, Winning in Space Opera. How does one win in a role-playing game? The answer is one does and one doesn't. In other words, there are never any victory conditions set in a role-playing game that any more than there are in any clear victory conditions set in real life. When does a man win? Whenever he attains his life's desires, or at least has a good, exciting, fulfilling run for his money. When does a man lose? Whenever he fails to use his talents, brains to take advantage of the opportunity. It goes on into greater detail on that. It's just like players and player characters. Now, there's a section here, and I'm not going to waste my time trying to find it. I read on. Okay. It talks about the player characters and their responsibilities. The players and player characters. How many characters? They actually recommend in this game system that of each player have several characters. And the reason for that is that there are times when your character needs to, quote, take leave so they can go take training or they can be healing up. Because this game doesn't allow for instant potions of healing or instant knowledge. You really need to devote certain amounts of element time in your campaigns to developing characters or fixing damage. Therefore, if you were to have several characters, this would allow your player to put one on the shelf for 2 or 3 sessions and bring out a second character and play it from a different perspective. And it also presents opportunities to explore different elements of a much grander universe. So, ideally, you could actually have several sub-campaigns going on, similar to what you would find in novels. This is where you have your players have 2 or 3 different groups of people, and they explore different aspects that may or may not be interrelated. It's a matter of perspective. I've seen this type of style in Star Trek as well. One of the things that Star Trek sets it apart from other sci-fi games or games in general is most often it's based off of a specific spaceship, a specific starship. So you're members of a crew of a spaceship. Now that has a lot of challenges in and of itself because of how do you not become dominated by, and how is it that this player character specializes in this? He's the officer, this guy's the captain, this guy's the science, and then they don't have conflicts of interest. I made the argument just recently to somebody who was questioning how to run a modern version of Star Trek, that perhaps it would be better to have the player characters as being mid-level or junior level officers on a bigger ship. That way the key officers are NPCs and the junior officers, the players, are going to take orders. And this is our mission. The ship's going to go do this. They have no say in the matter, and what their job is to make sure do their part to make sure the mission's successful. Now, if you were to allow for several sets of characters, you could have different groups of people doing different things that are interlocked with each other to some degree, and allow for some wider range of play, which is a concept that came up in here. It also talked about the fact that characters in general, what sets them apart from the common man. This is why when you look at their section on taking damage and wounds, and these are the above average people. These are not the people that stay home. If they were common people, they would stay home, raise families, have a safe job, maybe occasionally have an issue. These people embrace those issues. They seek them out actively. They go out of their way. They are above standard. They're heroic for a reason. And I like the way they approached it. So, when we talk about the classes and some of their terminology, of course, is archaic. It's based off of older game systems. The guy that made the Starship Troopers, for example, this is heavily influenced by that game system. And to some degree, the Linsmith series, which I read a few of, and a lot of Heinz stuff, right? Not so much of Lucas's and Star Wars, because this was just coming out. they were in the process of creating this when Star Wars hit the shelves. So I'm sure, or hit the movies. So I'm sure it did play a little bit, but not so much. And there's also elements of Dune in here. You can find bits and pieces of stuff that are so obviously linked to existing systems, novels and series, that you almost wonder how they didn't get nailed for plagiarism. But it's just what it is. I'm not going to make a rail on it or not. So when we talk about character classes, more archaic terms, the armsman, the tech, the research scientist, the medical scientist, the engineering scientist, the astronaut. Not a lot of options. But within those options, there's gobs and gobs of flexibility. This is where we get into the chapter on page after page of skills. I mean, there's literally 100 skills, or damn close. And most of them are geared toward specific classes, of course. But any class can take, if they can meet the bare requirements, can take any skill to enhance their abilities. Then we got into sections on creating the character race. Once the personal characteristics and planet of birth have been determined for the player will have to decide on the interstellar race to which his character belongs. The following races are available for roleplay. They may represent groups integrated into the Terran Federation of Planets, or they may come from independent cultures. Humans and humanoids, transhumans, Pythine races, canine races, the feline races, the Ursoid races, avian races, warm-blooded Surian races. And it doesn't give you, this is the Kai, this is the type. Like a lot of systems today, you would go in, okay, here's the Masaki. It's a fox-based alien species that has all the similarities of a walking, talking fox, or the guy, the character from Guardians of the Galaxy that plays the raccoon. I'm just saying. It doesn't say that. It gives you the stats, the statistics, the stuff you need as the creator to craft your own. So you either can take stuff from their later supplements and use them, or you craft your own. And they give you the mechanics for it. It's just like the planets. They give you all the information you need to roll up and design a planet in a star system without giving you pre-made stuff in the core books. Those come in later supplement books. I won't argue that. And then we got PC depth, PC shock resistance, wound recovery rate. I'd like to focus on that a little bit at some point, but not right now. Fatigue, wind, movement, PC intelligence checks, intuition checks, bravery checks. They have a lot more stats. There's quite a few more stats than what you would see in more modern systems today. It's what makes it a little more chunky because you have more options. But there's also a beautiful section here, and I think I read a piece of that on a recent vlog I did for the VR response channel. Take what you need, use what you're going to use, and discard the rest. It's simple. If you're not going to do things with science, then ignore the science characters. Ignore all the skill sets for them. If you're going on about your version of Starship Troopers, then focus on the material rules that you need to make that functionable. Don't use the other stuff. Then I got an entire chapter on, I call employment. The Star Forces, Starfleet, Space Marines, rank promotions. I mean, they go into some great detail. They even talk about retirement and pensions and mustering out and what you get. So if you were to create a character who's a veteran Marine from the Space Marines, and he's retired from the service, you can go back and figure out how much money he walked away with, how much equipment and gear he's allowed, what his rank was, and what potential contacts that he could tap into in his next line of career, whatever that's going to be. And then you have all these government bureaucracies that you can belong to. They spend more time talking about the ranks and the stats for pay than they do about the actual government entity, and that's in part because they leave that up to the Star Master to fluff up, to flush out, and for these later supplements to kind of ease the passage on that, so to speak. Knowledge and skills. Here's that section on sciences and medicine. There's, see, several pages, and then there's the skills and rules, and those cover about 15 pages. Then we get into psionics. Psionics is a catch-all. It's meant to cover magic in space, the magic of the powers of the mind, or the magic of interacting with the elements and controlling them in unusual ways. Types of psionic talents, acquisition of psionic talents, the psionic awakening. That's another thing. They initially set it up on purpose that you don't automatically start out with psionics. No player character begins the game with them unless you choose to do that as a player, or as a GM. They have what they call the awakening. So every so often they're allowed to make a roll if they have sufficient psionic points in their stat. They get to make a roll plus a modifier. And if they awaken, then they can begin the journey of exploring these things. It's like Luke, you have to assume Luke was a special child that was capable of doing some unusual things compared to his friends, and it was downplayed or pushed down. One of the reasons his parents, his aunt and uncle kept him isolated, I imagine, from most of his peers until he was much older. Then there's the possibility of the awakening. Maybe he didn't know he had his Force talents and powers until he hit a point where Obi-Wan said, "Hey, wake up," and began his journey. So it's a matter of how did you develop your abilities. And in here they focus on being psionics, which, if you're familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, it's pretty heavy in there too. I just find it interesting that these guys came out with the concept much sooner than TSR did. I don't know if TSR capped into this or what, or but there was a movement of the powers of the mind. They were basically more interested in the powers of the element, the powers of nature being utilized, i.e. magic as we know it, right? So we've got a load of stuff, the pyro psi, the chiral psi, levitate, stress, battle, screen, teleportation, life sense, so on and so on. There's page at clairvoyance and leadership and, quote, the force. They actually do attempt to address it to some degree. So the force is perhaps nothing more than a vast energy source, but then again, it may be something far greater. Adepts who have a tendency to attach almost a religious significance to the force, but not in a superstitious fashion. For them, the force is a very real part of their lives. And it goes in, so, without overtly stealing it from Star Wars. They came really close. But the verbiage is the important thing. Nobody coined and patented, put a copyright on the term the force. So once you explain it in your own words, you're avoiding you're getting out of the gray area. Combat damage, dealing with vehicle combat, starship maintenance requirements, hiring battle damage, blah blah blah, starships, blah blah blah. So I'm going to show you. This is the type of pictures quite commonly used to show starships. They have very few exterior views, mostly interior floor plans, so you can kind of play in them, not admire them from the outside. They leave that up to you to do your own artwork. Now later, when we explore some of the core books, or some of the supplement books for starships, you'll see what I'm talking about. They're very 2D, two-dimensional in their appearance, and they don't have any flashy artwork to show them, in part because a ship is a ship is a ship, okay? If you put it in a certain class, its capabilities and its capacity and its specific details should be almost identical to everybody else's in that same type of class. There might be some minor differences, but the physical aesthetics, that's what sets them apart. So if I have a feline race, and I have an aviary race, and I have a human race, and each one builds a medium stock freighter, physically speaking, mechanically speaking, interior space using similar technology is going to be pretty identical. It's the aesthetics that's going to make them look different. Well, instead of having 1,000 different looking ships filling page after page of source books that they just pound off onto the players or the buyer, us as forms of making money. They leave it up to us to come up with the aesthetics. And that was a different time, different mindset of gaming of the day. So, welcome to my beginning of my exploration of the Space Opera system, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you will join me with it. This is Volume 1. We'll do another one on Volume 2, which probably will run close to 30 minutes. Hopefully the rest will weigh less than 15. That's my plan. Hope I can keep it.